They called it a win. The flags went up, the reports sounded calm. But something didn't return, not confidence, not certainty, not the future they expected. What followed wasn't defeat. It was quieter than that. The title of this story is not about a single moment on a battlefield. It is about what happens after, about how a result that looks successful can quietly expose limits that were never meant to be seen. Because what mattered next was not what Britain achieved, but what it had to absorb. On the surface, order remained intact. Commands were issued. Institutions continued to function. The machinery of authority moved forward, steady and familiar. From the outside, control appeared preserved. There was no visible collapse, no public reckoning. The system had endured stress and remained standing. But endurance is not the same as stability. Control, at this stage, became procedural rather than confident. Decisions were still made, but their purpose subtly shifted. They were no longer shaping a future. They were protecting the present, holding ground emotionally, not advancing it psychologically. This is where the illusion formed. Because when systems survive pressure, they often mistake survival for strength. They assume that because nothing broke, nothing changed. In reality, pressure rarely announces its damage. It settles quietly. It narrows options. It turns certainty into calculation. Britain's authority still spoke with structure, but it listened differently now. Each decision carried an unspoken awareness of limits, not limits imposed by an enemy, but limits revealed internally. The sense of permanence that once supported confidence had thinned. What remained was caution, discipline, and restraint. There was no panic in this phase, no dramatic shift, just adjustment. Language softened, expectations lowered, control tightened inward. The system learned how to hold itself together rather than how to move forward. This kind of control is fragile because it depends on denial. Admitting the strain would mean admitting a loss that had no clear moment, a loss without surrender, a loss without defeat. And that is the hardest kind to acknowledge. So the illusion stayed intact. Authority remained visible. Order remained functional. But beneath it, confidence had begun to erode. Not suddenly, not loudly, but steadily enough to change everything that followed. There was no moment that could be pointed to as failure, no clear breaking point, no visible collapse. And that was the problem. Pressure without defeat is difficult to recognize because it does not arrive with alarms. It settles into routine. It disguises itself as normal function. Britain had not been pushed out. It had not been undone. What it faced instead was a constant, accumulating strain that offered no release. The system continued to operate, but the cost of keeping it operational quietly increased. Each decision required more effort. Each commitment demanded greater restraint. The margin for error narrowed, not because of chaos, but because resilience was being consumed simply to remain standing. This kind of pressure does not come from losing ground. It comes from holding too much of it for too long. Without a clear defeat, there was no permission to step back, no justification to reassess openly. Retreat, even psychological retreat, would have implied weakness. So endurance became the default response. The expectation was not to resolve the strain, but to absorb it. Over time, this absorption changed behavior. Caution replaced confidence. Initiative gave way to maintenance. Risk was no longer weighed against opportunity, but against survival. Not survival in the physical sense, but survival of authority, of credibility, of the image of control that still mattered deeply. What made this pressure especially corrosive was its invisibility. There was nothing dramatic to react to, no singular loss to process. The strain simply remained, constant and unresolved, pressing inward on every layer of decision-making. This is where psychological erosion accelerates. When pressure has no outlet, it turns inward, it reshapes thinking, It teaches institutions to avoid exposure rather than pursue clarity. The goal quietly shifts from progress to preservation, from shaping outcomes to preventing embarrassment, instability, or admission of limits. Britain did not break under this weight, but it adjusted itself around it. And adjustment, repeated enough times, becomes transformation. What emerged was a system that still functioned, but with less flexibility, less confidence, less room to move. The structure held, but its internal tension increased. Like a material bent just short of fracture, it carried stress silently, storing consequences for later. This is the danger of pressure without defeat. It convinces those inside it that endurance is enough, that as long as nothing collapses, nothing is wrong. In reality, the damage is already underway. Leadership is often judged by outcomes, by whether control is maintained, whether authority remains visible, whether decisions appear effective from a distance. Under pressure, those measures can be misleading. At this stage, leadership had not failed. Orders were followed, structures held, responsibility was still clearly defined, yet inside that clarity, something more fragile was taking shape. The stress facing those in command was no longer about overcoming obstacles. It was about navigating limits that could not be openly acknowledged. Every decision carried an added layer of weight, not because options were unclear, but because none of them offered relief. Authority remained, but certainty did not. Leaders were required to project confidence while privately managing doubt. Not doubt about competence, but doubt about sustainability. The question was no longer whether decisions could be executed, but whether they could continue indefinitely without consequence. This creates a specific kind of psychological strain. When leaders cannot admit pressure, they absorb it alone. Responsibility narrows, communication becomes careful. Risk is managed, not through boldness, but through containment. The goal shifts quietly from shaping outcomes to preventing visible damage. What emerges is a leadership style defined by restraint, fewer assumptions, less optimism, decisions framed around what must not happen rather than what could be achieved. Over time, this inward focus changes how authority functions. It becomes heavier. Leadership under this kind of stress does not collapse outward. It tightens inward. It prioritizes control over clarity, discipline over adaptability. Not because of fear, but because exposure feels dangerous when confidence is already eroding. The most difficult part is that this stress rarely appears in records. It does not leave obvious traces. From the outside, leadership looks intact. From the inside, it feels increasingly isolated. Each decision becomes a calculation of endurance. How much strain can be carried without acknowledgement? How long can stability be maintained without renewal? There are no easy answers in this phase, only compromises, each one small, each one reasonable, and each one adding to a growing internal burden. This is how leadership begins to change shape, not through failure, but through accumulation, through responsibility carried without release, through pressure that cannot be shared. The system continues to function. Authority remains visible. But the people holding it are no longer supported by certainty. They are sustained by discipline alone. And discipline, without confidence, is a heavy thing to carry. Beneath leadership, the pressure did not disappear. It moved downward. Those tasked with carrying out decisions lived inside the consequences of restraint. Their world narrowed to routine, repetition, and endurance. Not because they were unaware of the strain above them, but because they felt it without context. Orders arrived without explanation. Expectations remained, even as meaning slowly thinned. This is how weight travels through a system. For the men sustaining daily function, the absence of defeat did not feel like success. It felt like suspension. Progress was no longer visible. Purpose became harder to articulate. What remained was obligation, quiet, constant, and rarely questioned. Endurance replaced belief. Psychological strain at this level does not express itself through fear or rebellion. It expresses itself through normalization. Long hours feel ordinary. Emotional distance becomes necessary. Adaptation is not celebrated, it is assumed. Over time, this reshapes identity. When individuals are asked to carry weight without understanding its direction, they stop expecting resolution. Survival becomes practical rather than hopeful. The goal is no longer to achieve something meaningful, but to remain functional without breaking routine. There is no language for erosion at this level, no space to articulate loss. The system rewards steadiness, not reflection. Those who endure quietly are seen as reliable. Those who question are seen as unnecessary risk. So silence becomes a form of discipline. This silence is not imposed aggressively. It emerges naturally from exhaustion, from the realization that expression changes nothing, from the understanding that stability depends on compliance more than comprehension. What makes this phase especially heavy is its invisibility. The weight carried here does not register in outcomes or decisions. It registers in diminished expectation, in the gradual shrinking of inner space, in the quiet acceptance that endurance has no endpoint. This is not collapse. It is adaptation under pressure. And adaptation, when prolonged, can hollow out purpose without ever announcing itself. By the time this erosion is noticed, it already feels normal. Routine has replaced urgency. Weight has replaced intention. The system still moves. Tasks are completed. Order remains. But the cost is being absorbed silently by those least able to refuse it. There comes a point when movement forward quietly stops being the objective. Not because progress is impossible, but because maintaining balance requires too much attention. This shift does not arrive with announcement. It settles gradually, almost unnoticed, into the way decisions are framed. At this stage, survival was no longer a temporary condition. It became the organizing principle. The system was no longer asking how to expand influence or reshape outcomes. It was asking how to hold together what still functioned. Stability mattered more than direction. Continuity mattered more than ambition. This kind of psychological transition is subtle but decisive. When survival becomes the goal, energy is redirected inward. Resources are managed cautiously. Commitments are measured by their risk rather than their value. The language of confidence fades, replaced by careful phrasing and reduced expectation. Nothing appears broken, yet nothing feels open. The pressure at this phase is not intense in the way crisis is intense. It is constant. It huns beneath every decision. It teaches restraint as a default response. Over time, this restraint shapes behavior, thought, and identity. Survival thinking narrows vision. Options that once felt possible now feel irresponsible. Flexibility is treated as exposure. The safest path becomes repetition, even if repetition leads nowhere new. The system learns how to persist, not how to recover. What is lost here is difficult to measure. It is not territory or authority in the traditional sense. It is momentum. It is the internal belief that endurance is a means to something beyond itself. Without that belief, survival becomes static. This does not feel like failure to those inside it. It feels like responsibility, like maturity, like restraint earned through experience. And that is why it is so difficult to reverse. Survival becomes framed as wisdom, but endurance without renewal slowly drains capacity. Each cycle of holding on consumes more effort than the last. The system remains intact, but it becomes heavier to carry. At this point, the future is no longer imagined. It is managed. This is the quiet turning point where endurance stops being a phase and becomes a condition, where the goal is not to move forward, but to avoid falling apart. And once that shift occurs, everything that follows is shaped by it. Some costs are easy to measure. They appear in records, summaries, and outcomes. Others never take shape in any formal way. They exist only as accumulated strain, spread across time and responsibility. This was that kind of cost. What had been spent was not announced. It was absorbed. Energy, flexibility, and confidence were slowly consumed to sustain an appearance of continuity. Because nothing collapsed, nothing was officially lost. And because nothing was officially lost, there was no language to account for what had quietly diminished. The system continued to function, but it did so by drawing from its own reserves. Every act of restraint carried a price. Every delayed decision required patience that could not be renewed. Over time, the effort needed to maintain stability increased, while the capacity to adapt decreased. This imbalance was not visible from the outside, but it shaped everything internally. What makes uncounted cost especially corrosive is that it cannot be addressed directly. You cannot repair what you do not acknowledge. And acknowledgement would have required admitting that endurance itself had become expensive, so the cost remained unnamed. Instead of being measured, it was normalized. Fatigue became expected. Limitations became accepted. The idea that things might feel lighter again quietly disappeared from the collective imagination. This kind of erosion does not feel dramatic. It feels administrative. It shows up in slower responses, narrower choices, and a growing preference for caution over clarity. The system becomes careful, not because care is wise, but because risk feels unaffordable. What is lost here is not power in the obvious sense. It is resilience, the ability to absorb future strain without distortion. By spending that resilience slowly, the system ensured that any new pressure would feel heavier than it should. This is how consequences accumulate without recognition. There was no moment to point to, no decision that could be blamed. The cost was distributed too evenly, too quietly to be isolated, and that made it permanent. By the time the weight of this uncounted cost became noticeable, it had already reshaped expectations. What once felt temporary now felt structural. What once required effort now felt inevitable. Some losses do not announce themselves because they were never meant to be seen. Some losses don't leave records. History is shaped by contrast. It remembers clear victories and obvious defeats because they are easy to frame. They offer resolution. They allow narratives to close. What happened here offered neither. There was no collapse to examine, no moment of surrender to explain. What unfolded instead was gradual, unresolved, and uncomfortable. It did not fit the language history prefers to use. So it was buried, not deliberately erased, but quietly set aside. The story did not disappear. It faded. It became background context rather than central explanation, a footnote to larger movements, a transition that felt too complex to linger on. Psychological erosion is difficult to preserve because it lacks drama. It does not present itself as a turning point. It spreads across decisions, habits, and expectations. By the time it becomes visible, it no longer feels like an event. It feels like the natural order of things, and history tends to accept what feels natural. There was also discomfort in the implications. To examine this phase closely would mean admitting that survival itself can weaken systems, that endurance, when prolonged without renewal, can quietly reduce capacity. This is not an easy conclusion to hold, especially for institutions that define themselves through resilience. So emphasis shifted elsewhere. Attention moved to moments that felt cleaner, to outcomes that could be categorized, to stories where responsibility was clearer and consequences more immediate. The unresolved strain that followed this victory did not disappear, but it was no longer named. Silence became convenient. That silence did not mean the experience was forgotten by those who lived inside it. It meant their experience was never translated into narrative form. Without language, it could not be passed on. Without framing, it could not be examined. This is how erosion escapes memory. What remains is a simplified version of events, stripped of psychological depth, a record that acknowledges outcome but avoids consequence, stability without context, endurance without cost. The absence of this story from the center of historical memory is not accidental. It reflects a preference for clarity over complexity, for moments that end rather than conditions that persist. And so the quieter truth was left behind, not because it lacked importance, but because it resisted conclusion. Silence was easier than explanation. This story does not end with collapse. It ends with something more difficult to define. Britain did not fall apart in the aftermath. Authority remained. Structures endured. From the outside, continuity appeared preserved. Yet what survived was no longer what had existed before. A threshold had been crossed quietly, without ceremony or acknowledgement. What was almost lost was not control, but range. The ability to move freely, to absorb pressure without narrowing, to imagine outcomes without first calculating cost. These capacities had been slowly spent in the effort to endure. By the time the spending became visible, it felt irreversible. This is the nature of quiet consequence. When erosion happens gradually, it does not announce itself as loss. It presents itself as adjustment, as realism, as restraint shaped by experience. And because these qualities are often valued, the deeper change goes unquestioned. What remained was endurance without dominance, stability without momentum, a system that could continue but only within tighter boundaries than before. This was not failure, but it was not victory either. It was survival at a reduced scale. The absence of drama in this ending is important. There is no final reckoning here, no clear lesson to extract, only the recognition that some turning points do not arrive as events. They arrive as conditions that settle and stay. History often treats such moments as transitions rather than conclusions. But transitions matter. They shape everything that follows. Once limits are internalized, they do not need to be enforced from outside. This is what makes the outcome so enduring. Britain moved forward from this moment intact, but altered, not by defeat, but by the accumulated weight of having to hold itself together. The loss was not total, it was partial, and that partial loss proved lasting. Almost lost does not mean nearly destroyed, it means permanently changed. And change that goes unacknowledged tends to define the future more than any victory ever could. It wasn't the end, just the moment everything changed.